This next story is one that has haunted a family for generations. It's a tale from the late 18th century, set in the heart of colonial Mexico, where the walls of an old hacienda hold secrets darker than anyone could have imagined. This story was sent to us by Isabella, and as I read it, you'll see why it's been whispered about in her family for centuries. So, turn down the lights, and let's dive into the haunting of Hacienda del Sol. Dear Mr. Phantom Knight, they say that the past never truly leaves us, that it lingers in the places we hold dear, in the bloodlines that carry on through the centuries. My family learned this the hard way, through a series of events that have been whispered about for generations. The story I'm about to tell you is one that I've pieced together from old letters, journals, and the fragmented memories of my ancestors. It's a story that begins in the late 1700s, at a place called Hacienda del Sol. The hacienda was a grand estate, built by my ancestor, Señor Gabriel Morales, a man whose wealth and influence were matched only by the mysteries surrounding him. The house was a symbol of his power, its walls rising high against the horizon, casting long shadows over the land as the sun dipped below the mountains. But those walls, strong as they were, couldn't keep out what was to come. Gabriel's wife, my namesake, Isabella, was a woman of beauty and grace, adored by all who knew her. But soon after they moved into the hacienda, strange things began to happen. At first, it was just small disturbances. Cold drafts in the middle of summer, the flicker of candle flames without any breeze, the sound of footsteps in the hallways when no one was there. But then, the disturbances became more intense. One night, as Isabella lay in bed, she was jolted awake by the sound of scratching, like fingernails dragging across wood. It was coming from the corner of the room, where the shadows were darkest. She held her breath, straining to hear over the pounding of her heart, but the noise had stopped. Thinking it was just a dream, she tried to calm herself and drift back to sleep. But then, it came again. Louder this time, more insistent. She shot up in bed, her eyes darting to the corner. The room was pitch black, save for the sliver of moonlight creeping through the curtains. As she stared into the darkness, something shifted, just barely, but enough to make her blood run cold. She could see the outline of a figure, hunched and gaunt, its back turned to her. She froze, unable to move or scream, her body paralyzed by fear. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, its presence overwhelming, suffocating. And then, without warning, it turned. Two glowing eyes locked onto hers, burning with an intensity that made her heart skip a beat. The figure took a step forward, and in that instant, Isabella felt a cold hand wrap around her ankle, yanking her down into the bed. She screamed, thrashing wildly. But when Gabriel burst into the room, there was nothing. No figure, no hand, just the echo of her own terrified cries. Gabriel tried to calm her, but she could see the fear in his eyes. He didn't believe her, not at first, but the nights that followed made it impossible to deny. The sounds, the cold spots, the flickering lights, whatever was haunting the hacienda wasn't going away. And it seemed to be growing stronger, feeding off their fear. The servants were the first to flee, leaving the hacienda one by one as the disturbances became too much to bear. They spoke of shadows that moved on their own, of doors slamming shut with no one nearby, of whispers in the dead of night that chilled them to the bone. They said the hacienda was cursed, that something evil had taken root within its walls. Gabriel, desperate to protect his wife and his home, called upon Father Santiago, the village priest. The priest was a man of strong faith, known for his ability to banish evil spirits. He arrived at the hacienda one evening, the sun casting long shadows as it set behind the mountains. But as soon as he stepped inside, he knew this was no ordinary haunting. That night, Father Santiago began his work, blessing each room with holy water, reciting prayers meant to cleanse the house of its darkness. But as he moved through the hacienda, he could feel the tension in the air, like the calm before a storm. And then, just as he entered the master bedroom, the temperature plummeted. His breath fogged before him as he stood at the doorway, and in that moment, the air seemed to hum with an energy so malevolent, it made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. He began to pray, louder and more fervently, his voice echoing off the walls. But then, without warning, the door slammed shut behind him, sealing him inside. He spun around, the rosary clutched tightly in his hand, but there was no one there. The room was silent, the only sound the rapid beating of his heart. And then, the scratching began again. This time, it was coming from all around him, as if something was circling him, just out of sight. His prayers grew frantic, his voice trembling as he tried to keep his composure. But the sound grew louder, more insistent, and then just as suddenly, it stopped. Father Santiago stood frozen, his eyes scanning the room, searching for the source of the noise. And then he felt it, a cold breath against the back of his neck. He whipped around, but there was nothing, only the darkness closing in around him. He backed away slowly, his heart hammering in his chest, until he felt the edge of the bed against his legs. And that's when he saw it, two glowing eyes staring at him from the foot of the bed. They were the same eyes Isabella had described, burning with a fiery intensity that seemed to pierce his very soul. The figure was there, hunched and gaunt, its skin pale and stretched tight over its bones. And as it moved closer, Father Santiago could see its mouth twist into a sinister grin, revealing sharp, jagged teeth. The priest raised his rosary, shouting a prayer, but the figure lunged at him, its icy hands closing around his throat. The room spun as Father Santiago struggled, his vision blurring as he gasped for air. But just as he thought he was about to be consumed by the darkness, the figure vanished, leaving him alone in the silent room. When the door finally creaked open, Gabriel found the priest collapsed on the floor, his face pale and his hands trembling. He had seen enough. The hacienda was cursed, haunted by a force beyond their understanding, and it was clear that whatever had taken hold of the house wasn't going to leave them in peace. From that night on, the disturbances became more violent. Objects were thrown across rooms, windows shattered, and the walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own. Isabella's condition worsened, her once vibrant spirit now a shadow of its former self. She spoke of nightmares, visions of death and despair, of blood-stained floors and the wails of the damned. And always, there were those eyes, watching her from the darkness, waiting to claim her soul. Gabriel, desperate to save his wife, made the difficult decision to leave the hacienda. They packed their belongings and fled in the dead of night, the walls of the house seeming to groan in protest as they left. But even as they rode away, Isabella couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed, that those eyes were still watching, still waiting. They never returned to Hacienda del Sol, and in time, the house fell into ruin, consumed by the elements and the passage of time. But the stories persisted, passed down through the generations like a dark inheritance. And now, all these years later, I can still feel its presence, like a shadow that refuses to fade. So, Mr. Phantom Knight, I share this story with you not just as a piece of my family's history, but as a warning. Some places, some secrets, are better left undisturbed, because sometimes the past doesn't stay buried. Sometimes it comes back to haunt us, in ways we can never truly escape. And that was Isabella's story of the Hacienda del Sol. A chilling reminder that the past can cast long shadows, shadows that stretch across time, reaching out to those of us who dare to remember. If you have a story you'd like to share, don't hesitate to send it in. Until then, stay curious, stay cautious, and keep watching the shadows. See you next time.